Well, for those of you who don't recognize him, Chad is our guest speaker tonight, and we're really glad to have him, especially since this is the makeup for the power outage day, and Chad was so flexible and happy to come here. You've been, this is your second stint with WLFI, I think?
It is. The first one was 6 years, and now I think I'm on year 4, year 5. Yeah.
Well, we're glad to have you back, and tonight's topic, historic severe weather events prior to 65, because we don't want any we can remember.
He brings up a good point. Yeah, I thought, well, 65 is going to rank way up there, the Palm Sunday outbreak, so I got to go before 65, you know.
Yeah. So thank you all, and take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Well, thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I appreciate you all being here. I know it's still nice outside and it's still daylight, so it's just good to be with you all tonight. I appreciate your interest in weather and interest in weather history here as well. I recognize some of your faces, so maybe I've seen some of you at other talks I've given or in the community. So again, thanks a lot for coming. As I said, the reason why I went with prior to 1965 is because if I took every event from now all the way back, 200 years, Palm Sunday, the Super Outbreak of 74, and the 94 F4 on the west side of town would all be in the 3 out of the 10. So I thought, well, I need to go a little more obscure. I want to go farther back, maybe more of a challenge, digging and finding some of these very interesting events. And you might wonder, well, how did you come up? Why did you pick these certain events? I picked them based on their kind of their psychological impact here, the damage impact in our area, the spatial extent of the damage, the violence of each event. Granted, there are no floods here, there are no snowstorms, there are no heat waves. This is all severe weather, and it doesn't have to be a tornado. It can be hail, wind, or a plain violent or strong tornado. And what I wanted to do was maybe save the flooding and the winter discussions for a later event. Maybe we can dig into those because there's some really interesting blizzards and snowstorms and ice storms. You could devote an entire evening to ice storms. You really could, right? So many in our area. Yes, the 91. Yes. And that brings up a good point. You remember that day like it was yesterday. That's another thing why I wanted to do with this, because these are generational events. When we talk about 78, everybody talks, they remember where they were in 78. If you would have grown up in the 1917-18 winter, you would have remembered the 17-18 winter. You remember Palm Sunday of 65. If you grew up in the 1880s, you probably would have remembered several violent tornado outbreaks in the 1880s, or really the worst winter on record, the 1884-1885 winter, which was brutal, and the 1881 heat wave too, which was brutal as well, similar to 1936. So without further ado, I've ranked these events. I'll talk about why I ranked them where they are and what the big impact of each event was. So we're going to start May 12th, 1886. This is number 1. I should have gone 10, 9, 8, but I'll go number 1. This, we talk about 65 and the super outbreak of 74. This was the most prolific and violent outbreak I could find on record for our viewing area. And remember, what I consider the geographical area covered in this is Newton County all the way down to Fountain County, eastward Howard, and then all the way to Fulton. That square area is kind of what we're talking about. We had at least 6 tornadoes in the viewing area, and it seemed that each tornado that occurred was strong to violent. And you might ask, well, how do you know that? It was 1886. What I'm doing is taking the damage reports, putting them into a modern day standard that the National Weather Service would use to rank a tornado. So if we've got reports in a newspaper of bent steel beams, we've got debarked trees that are 3 feet in diameter, we have a brick 2-story home that's leveled, what we're going to do is research the building trends at that time, apply it to the modern day National Weather Service guidelines, and come up with an estimation of a rating, a modern day rating for that tornado. Near Forest in Clinton County, 3.8-inch diameter hail was measured. That's almost 4 inches in diameter. That, a softball is more than 4 inches in diameter. And there's evidence, especially in northern Tipton County, kind of on our fringe, of winds up to 100 miles an hour. Not only did we have likely supercells with tornadoes and very large to large hail, but we also had what could have been kind of a morphing of supercells and eventual bow echo that swept through. A lot of these big violent events, you will have supercells with tornado and hail and wind. And then once those go through, you've got a squall line or a bow that rakes through with straight line wind damage, and then you're done with it. And that seems to be the case here. In Indiana, we had 59 deaths at least, and more than 110 injured. We had 43 people killed at Anderson from what was likely an EF3, EF4 tornado there. So what I did, I took all the damage reports and made it into a modern map. And what's interesting is when you take all these severe weather reports and you plot them on a map, it's like taking a tack. Okay, there's a storm report there, and you give it a time. You plot one here, give it a time. You plot one here, there. The outbreak comes to life. When you take old data like this and you start plotting reports and you start looking at it, all of a sudden you're like, it looks like modern day outbreaks you see. And you're like, this looks like 1990, or this looks like 1977, or this looks like 2002, whatever. This was a prolific outbreak though. And you can see the long track tornadoes over this 2-3 day period, especially right here in our area, the large hail and the wind as well. The hail, 1 inch diameter or greater is in green. Red dots are the tornado reports, and blue would be the wind damage or severe wind gusts that were measured. Now, how did I get all this information? A lot of exhaustive newspaper and diary research, and also the U.S. Weather Bureau has old archives. They printed out something called, you may be familiar with, the Monthly Weather Review. And the Monthly Weather Review was an archive of severe weather reports received via telegraph, and they would print up a report every month, and that began, I think, in 1873. So you can get a lot of information gleaned from that. But some of the best information you get is, the guy or the gal that owns a business, say on Columbia Street, or lives out west of town, and tells exactly what happened at their house, or such and such farm got hit. The amount of detail our pioneers gave helps me actually piece together a pretty accurate picture of the amount or the magnitude of an outbreak. This is damage in Attica. Attica was hit by a high-end EF3, possible low-end EF4 tornado. That tornado, I want to go back here, it began likely here in Vermilion County, Illinois. There was damage at Armstrong, Illinois. It tracked right through Fountain County, right up the Wabash River, and then apparently lifted in southwest Tippecanoe County and was much weaker at that point. But this is destruction in Attica. I mean, homes heavily damaged or destroyed. I believe this was a factory that made buggies, and it was pretty much completely obliterated. You see the damage here. Things unroofed. There's some roof damage back there, but this is kind of the heart of it. Okay, this is the wagon shop right here. Just a foundation is left. Some damage back here. It took out the bridge that went over the Wabash River at Attica as well. And this is other damage in Attica. Took this wall down, and you remember in 1886, a lot of these buildings weren't that old at that time. These were built pretty well. I mean, our downtown, these buildings are built stout by oak and walnut. They're not built by pine, that grows quickly like now. And you can see here it hit at 6 p.m. And it's always been called the Attica cyclone. And I just did a reconstruction of it, grabbing data. This is actually the map. This is May 13th at 7 o'clock in the morning. And we had one complex of storms that went through during the morning hours. And then, not to dig into the weather jargon too much, it's more historical, but a negatively tilted upper trough is very important to get a lot of severe weather here. So you think of it, the air is coming around the trough, and once it goes around the trough, it accelerates. So we basically have everything going up right here, right in this area. And my thought process here too is that the storms in the morning probably put out a little boundary in our area. You know, when it rains and it gets rain cooled, well, look what happened yesterday. You know, Fort Wayne had all those storms. Fort Wayne was cooler. We were 100. Where did the storms fire last night? They fired right on the edge of that line between cooler at Fort Wayne and warmer in our area. And that may have been a little bit of a catalyst to get more strong to violent tornadoes. It's just a theory, perhaps. A lot of times they develop that way. I think it'll let me move on. Maybe I'll stand back behind it or stand farther back. See, I broke it already. There we go. Thank you. Glad he's here because I'd be. I've had those situations where I'm in a pickle when I'm doing a presentation and it won't go forward. Number 2 is actually a derecho. Does everyone know what a derecho is? For example, it's a Boeing line of storms, very long-lived. Derechos have to last a very long time. I think the modern criteria, they have to travel more than 400 miles. They have to be at least 200 miles wide. And it's just a boa of severe storms. And they have to have widespread wind damage along the entire path. And they have to have wind gusts in the damage path of at least 75 miles an hour. So you can have a bunch of 60s and 58s and 65s, but you gotta have some hurricane force gusts with the line of storms. And there are 3 types of derechos. This one is called a progressive derecho. This is what happened in Fort Wayne last month. They had the 98-mile-per-hour wind gust at the Fort Wayne airport. It came, I believe, from like Iowa, Minnesota, went all the way down through Fort Wayne, all the way through Ohio, and these ride the edges of heat waves. This is derecho weather we've had. They ride the edges of heat waves, and you can track them. It's 100 here, maybe 80 up here, and that derecho follows that gradient. It's where the winds are strongest aloft. It's getting fed by the heat, but at the same time, it's on that railroad track riding the gradient. It likes to ride that gradient from cool and very hot. This is a super derecho. This is the worst derecho I have found on record for the state of Indiana. Widespread damaging winds. We had some corridors based on the damage of plus 100-mile-per-hour winds. I took the damage from near Linden and put it in the modern day NWS damage survey, and it was about 110 because there was a grain elevator that was completely blown off its foundation, blown and destroyed. I mean, the whole thing. And the newspaper said it was east of Linden, but I think what it is, I think it may be on the railroad north of Linden, because I think that's where the grain elevator was actually. But this had a 665-mile track. It was up to 100 miles wide, so a little short on width, but it still had the track length. So I mapped out every single report. It was a double derecho on the 27th, 28th of June of 1929. We had one track from Nebraska, hit Chicago very hard, northern Ohio, all the way to Pennsylvania. And then on its tail end, a new one formed here on June 29th. And you can see how it raked this entire region. This was very hot and dry. This was right on the edge of that heat wave. Similar to the weather we're kind of having right now. The damage reports, damage was heavy, structural damage, lots of trees down. Again, all the newspapers that you find, this is the Greencastle paper, heavy crop damage. You know what Iowa had a couple of years ago where all the corn was knocked down? All you read about in these reports, corn flat, corn flat. wheat flat. It was very damaging to crops. Oh, I don't know about that. That's a good one right there. I don't want to. But significant damage, power out for weeks, phones out for weeks. It really kind of crippled the state. And I'm going to miss some of the damage reports, but I just want to give you a few samples that show you that this was really intense. So it was a double derecho. We had a double derecho actually in 1933 and 1934. We also had one in 2013, but those tracked north of our area. So when this first started right here, it produced a 17-mile-long path of significant hail and wind damage in central Nebraska. Then, and this was in newspapers, a 75-mile path of heavy damage, southern Wisconsin. Heavy damage, corn flattened and corn loss in some counties, 90% in east central Iowa. Heavy damage in 14 counties. Heavy damage northwest Illinois, northern Indiana. This is just a sampling. 8-mile wide swath of intense wind damage in Vermilion County, Illinois. It blew into Warren, Benton, Tippecanoe, Fountain, Montgomery counties. Store windows were blown out in Crawfordsville. Crops and communication lines were damaged to a great extent in Lafayette and elsewhere in Tippecanoe County. That was from the Lafayette newspaper at the time. Corn flattened and snapped at the base, and it was pretty tall from what I'm gathering at Templeton, which is over here near Otterburn. Heavy damage reported at Williamsport, Attica, West Lebanon, Marshfield, where, quote, many roads, many small buildings, trees, crops, and communication lines were damaged. A car was actually lifted and carried off a road and rolled in a field as it came in at Fincastle, which is just south of southern Montgomery County. Many homes had roofed in Greencastle, thousands of trees down near Rockville. You get the idea. We had the highest wind gust on record at Indianapolis at 111 miles an hour. Windows blown out of homes and stores, 40 large trees down on South Belmont Avenue alone at Indy, Anderson, Shelbyville, Franklin, blah, blah, big storm. There was heavy damage at the Speedway too.
What about Southern Lake, Michigan?
There probably was. There likely was. If my memory serves me right, it probably was. And some of these produced a wave on the lake too, called a seiche, I guess you call them, a little tidal wave on the lake. But I would venture to say there were some loss on Lake Michigan. Okay. All right, I'll go to the next one. This is a big one. This is Lafayette. This was June 30th of 1877. And this was talked about for a long time in newspapers. The official record hailstone for the state of Indiana is 4.5 inches in diameter at Hartford City in 2000. And I feel like in 2006 we had one that was similar size too, or 2007, but it wasn't around here. This is a catastrophic hailstorm. Some of the buildings downtown witnessed that massive hail event, had their windows broken at that time. And in the newspapers, they measured stones anywhere from baseball size to about the size of a half brick or a small cantaloupe. And significant damage to windows, roofs. And this was actually part of a tornado outbreak. I plotted every report. We had a deadly tornado in south central Indiana. I believe there may have been 6 deaths in that tornado. And then the big hailstorm here, other tornadoes in the region, you see that was a big severe weather outbreak. And to get hail of that size, you would have to have an updraft well over 100 miles an hour. I mean, that is really significant to get hail that large here. And it was right here in Lafayette. It was reported that every window, every greenhouse, roofs were damaged. They called it an extraordinary hailstorm, lasted 5 minutes. It says that The average size was up to about 3 inches in diameter, which is the size of a goose egg. Damage was immense. And here are some of the reports. Taylor's lumber yard was a little smaller than a baseball. And one stone picked directly off Main Street, I don't know where, this is in the paper, was 4 inches wide and 5 inches long. And some were as large as a half brick. Yeah, and all skylights were shattered in the city. Southwest of the city on the Weah, the hail was goose egg size, but the hail at Stockwell was much smaller. And according to the reports, the intense storm did not extend much beyond the east side of the city limits at that time. So it dumped its load right here in town, it appears. And here is just reports on the tornadoes that occurred just south of Indianapolis, because that was part of a tornado outbreak. 1953, long track tornado. On the north side of the tornado track, there were multiple paths of 3-inch diameter hail, which is a goose egg. But this was the first hook echo reported on radar. This is the first time a hook was seen, and it was correlated with that's what a tornado could look like on radar. This is substantial farm damage and farmhouse damage. This tornado was actually pretty extensively studied by the U.S. Weather Bureau at that time. You know, after World War II, our radar and weather technology just blossomed. And we began studying how much wind does it take to do this kind of damage. These pictures are actually from far eastern Illinois. This is an actual picture of the tornado. This was taken, though, I believe, on the Champaign-Vermilion County line. That is the one that went through parts of the viewing area. That's the supercell. This is the weather radar at the Willard Airport, University of Illinois Airport at Champaign, that caught the tornado right there on radar. And right there are the storm reports. You can see right here, right, that long, significant tornado track. It was amazing there were not more people killed or injured in that tornado. And you might wonder, well, why did that tornado last so long? And you notice there's pretty much only one there, one main tornado. And what this was when I looked at surface maps, it was the cold front, the warm front, and the occluded front, all where they met. They call that a triple point. And that's where the shear is maximized, the change in wind direction, and that tornado rode the triple point all the way from Illinois right through Clinton County, or southern Tippecanoe, and just the entire way. We had damage at Odell. We had damage west of Odell. These are pictures from Clinton County, and you can see the tree damage. Again, this is an apparent silo that's just completely knocked off the home. You look here, the roof is completely missing. We have a thresher at that time, it appears, that was knocked over. Again, this piece of the silo knocked away, a wagon thrown over, just a sampling of some pictures from that point. So November 1911, this hit Lafayette hard as well. This was a derecho, but it wasn't a summertime derecho. Remember how I said there were 3 types? This was called a serial derecho, and it had multiple bows and came with a cold front or a storm system. It happened in November. It was in the mid to upper 70s that day. And when that went through, the temperature dropped into the teens, and it immediately went to snow. And the next day, I think the high was like in the mid to upper teens the day after. It was in the 70s. But very intense outbreak, a high risk kind of outbreak that we would see now. Widespread damaging winds with rain-wrapped tornadoes. One of these rain-wrapped tornadoes was really nasty up in Michigan and also at Waterloo, Indiana, probably at EF3. But damage was area-wide, but the only wording of a tornado was in Montgomery County, and that was hearsay in a newspaper. So we don't know how many tornadoes there were. We just know there was a lot of wind damage, and there probably were a few tornadoes wrapped in it. And then the observer at Purdue, because the weather records back then were taken at the Purdue Ag Building on campus. And on top of the building, he measured a sustained wind at 55. Some of the damage here is suggestive of winds about 90, 95 miles an hour. So here's the big outbreak. You see all the wind reports. You see the tornado reports here as well. Again, a high risk outbreak right in our area. This is damage in Lafayette, actually. You can see a piece of a power pole on a line here. Damage to a building, other damage. You can see debris in the tree here, kind of metal wrapped up in the tree, and other damage. And notice here, the snow on the ground. I believe these were taken the day after. Again, it was in the 70s before it hit, and then it tanked. You know, the weather has always been kind of wacky here. It was just as wacky back then. And there are some there's some speculation that this may have been a brief little tornado wrapped up in Lafayette. The worst damage was actually on the other side of the river in West Lafayette at that time. I don't have enough evidence to point in either direction. I need to know where that debris came from, and I don't know where the debris came from. Did it come from this building? Did it come from over here? I need to see a convergent wind pattern to determine if, yes, it was a tornado wrapped in wind. Another one many people are not aware of was 1916, March 22nd. This was a significant severe weather outbreak. This produced a significant tornado, a deadly tornado in our area. And what's interesting about it is it happened in the same way that the tri-state tornado happened. And it happened right with an area of low pressure. You know, normally when we're talking severe weather, you know, the storms are between the warm front and cold front. They're right in the warm sector. This was right with the surface low, right on top of it, where the shear could be maximized, and it lasted a very long time. But a lot of immense damage. The Weather Bureau at the time, I don't know whether this was the damage just in our area or it was the damage in the region. It really doesn't state that. So I don't know, but it said in 1916 dollars, 1 to 1.5 million in damage. I mean, that's like $40 million in damage. So I don't know that's here. I don't know whether that's region wide. It's hard to say. 6 deaths in our viewing area, more than 100 injured, many seriously in White and Cass County. And the track was northern White through Cass counties in the morning. This happened in the early morning hours. This was not in the afternoon. It was a morning tornado. And then there was a swath of really destructive wind south of Kentland to Remington and over northern Miami County. A train was rolled over the tracks. It's hard to say if that was a tornado or not. It's a pretty broad swath of damage. It points more towards the straight line winds there, but this is definitely tornado damage in northern White and Cass counties. They're pretty small outbreak, but you can see the tornado track accompanied by hail up to golf ball size. And here are the newspaper clippings from that event from our area. I believe this may have come from the Logansport paper, but there's the low that went right over the area, and the tornado was right with the surface low. And that's what happened with the Great Tri-State Tornado of 1925. And you can see ahead of it, it was 20 degrees warmer, and look behind it, 20 to 30 degrees colder. So a very strong storm there. This is damage from that tornado in eastern Illinois. What's odd to me, some of these tornadoes, I just can't find pictures. And they're probably, somebody's attic has a whole load of some pictures from these tornadoes, but they're kind of hard to access. 7 out of 10, the March 20th, 1866 tornado. Some of the stuff I've read about this one is just really impressive. It was long lasting. It was a long track. And I have long thought that this is a low end EF5 tornado ever since I discovered it back when I was in college. And it was reportedly a mile wide at times, the damage swath, had very large hail, more than 3 inches in diameter north of the track. But there were very large articles like wagons and tin wash tubs thrown great distances. And one report was that there were large trees that were debarked and twisted. And when trees are debarked like that, that's usually a sign of a very intense tornado. This is a reconstruction of the surface map that day. Right there's the low. You see it. That's the surface low. The warm front is right here. And if you look, maybe I've got a slide of that. Okay, yeah, I did do that. You can see the damage right here. There's the tornado, the long track tornado in our area, and then the wind and the hail damage. And then I went further and drew the map out. I took observations, and then I took all the barometric pressure observations and tried to sketch this thing out, what was going on. And it appears that there was actually a dry line that got as far east as Southwest Illinois. That happened in the tri-state tornado in 1925. It happened in a violent tornado outbreak in 1956. Sometimes you can get a dry line pretty far east. And the tornadoes seem to coincide. It was just to the right of the surface low. So it would have been right here, pretty close to the 70, 65 degree line. So you can see that it was right in that pocket where the dry line, the low, and the warm front were all kind of located. And that was at 7 p.m. on March 20th. And this is the general damage track. I apologize, this is a little hard to see, but if you look here, of all the reports gleaned, it looks like it may have started near the state line, definitely went north of Rockville, and then continued to move northeastward. Couldn't find any other reports from west of Lebanon. After that, it becomes a mystery. And if it would have been big, it probably would have been reported downstream. So my thoughts are, it probably lifted at that point. 8 out of 10, we're finally getting towards the end here. I did 2 tornadoes here. And the reason why these are important is these tornadoes are the first 2 ever recorded in Lafayette history. And I'm sure the Historical Society is aware of these 2 tornadoes in Lafayette. 1833 and 1835, June 2nd of 33, up to half mile wide, a few miles south of east. And the 1835 one on May 3rd occurred at night, quarter mile wide. It occurred on the southern edge of the village. Well, in Lafayette back then was tiny. The southern edge would be right over here. You know, it would be right here. And it was especially violent 1 mile east of the village. And it said that valuable timber was destroyed. You might say, well, valuable timber. Well, at that time, when Europeans first arrived here, this part of Lafayette, all the way to Murdoch Park along the Wabash, was heavily timbered. But once you got, say, out towards the old home hospital site and out towards 26, that was all prairie. And then once you get west of town, it's all prairie. So there was some really good, valuable oak timber right in this area. Oak and walnut and even some tulip tree in some of these ravines. So I think that's why valuable is mentioned. So again, it looks like a kid here using paint. I love Microsoft Paint because I've used it since like 1996 or whenever it came out. But it's easy to do. I like just doing this. So again, the village was only about this size. So to get our bearings straight, Jeff High School is down here. Central Catholic High School is here. These are approximations. I did the best I could measuring this out. Tippecanoe Mall is here. Of course, Cracker Barrel is out there. Purdue's here. There's the Purdue Airport. Here's the Wabash River. Here's Wabash Landing. So the 1835 one would be, right on the southern edge, and then a mile east. It was most violent. I think it took out a brick house out here. It would be near modern day Sagamore Parkway and South Street. And then the 33 one was pretty close to Central Catholic High School, actually, and then up towards Cracker Barrel. What's interesting to me is in the 1833 tornado, those old trees at the fairgrounds probably had limbs broken when that thing went by. In 1833, a lot of those trees dated back between 1810 and 1865. So the trees from 1810, were probably like that, and they probably had limbs broken from them. Number 9, 1912, very violent spring, multiple violent tornado outbreaks in the Midwest. And this was a big one. Hit Morocco, 20 homes destroyed at Morocco, 20 farmsteads destroyed, 10 killed, 77 injured at Morocco. It reportedly hit town from one end to the other. part of a big tornado outbreak, likely low end EF4, went from Newton to Jasper counties, had 3-inch hail with it. And it was a very violent period, April 20th through 22nd, 27th through 29th, 1912, had a series of tornado outbreaks in the plains of Midwest, just one after the other, after the other. And this is a farmstead, the Bowers place you see here at Morocco, with all of the damage after that tornado. And this is damage from that tornado at Chatsworth, Illinois. And you can see the destruction wrought by that tornado. And again, I mapped them out again. You can see the tornadoes kind of all tied up in the region and then all around the Chicago, Kankakee areas. What was interesting to me is that it was more wind damage southward. And then we had this one violent tornado, or strong tornado anyway, in southern Illinois, and some other tornadoes down here in parts of the southeast. Now, this is interesting. I was going to save this till the end. And you might wonder, well, how do we know we had a 1580s tornado? Well, I've got a copy of this article written here. Where is it? I've got it here. Okay, here it is. So there was this land surveyor in 1880, I think it was like 1884 and 85. He was doing land surveys in a very heavily wooded area in Park County, in Montgomery County, and Vermilion County. And, you know, that part of the area was still being logged. There was still old growth virgin timber in Park County in the 1880s. And a lot of it was being logged at that time. And as he was surveying, one thing he noticed was that everywhere he looked in this swath, in some places it was a mile wide, some places a half mile, but there were mounds everywhere in the woods, just big mounds of soil everywhere. And some were elongated, some were a little thinner, but they all kind of were all haphazard. You could tell something had happened where trees had just fallen and converged on each other in this big path. So he noticed some of the white oaks were growing on top of the mounds. And at that time they were logging. So he, explains, and I copied his whole write-up right here. And this was actually was published in the American Naturalist in the April 1886 issue. And it's called Track of a Cyclone Which Passed Over Western Indiana More than 300 years ago. So it's word for word what he's written here. And on top of the mounds, trees were growing. Big trees. And he said that they all had about 297 rings on them. It's very consistent age with a lot of these on top of these mounds. So he got to talking to people in the area, and he found that he started plotting where these huge mounds were everywhere. And he found a path. And he said he could, in the article, he could take like a tack and lay a string and then poke it in his map, and it was just a southwest to northeast path, and it was all consistently a half mile to a mile wide. And he said, you'd go from an old growth forest, and then there'd be a farm field. They just cleared it, but then it would pick right back up in the next woodlot nearby. So we started talking to people, and he talked to several locals down there that always talked about that area, and they call them Indian cemeteries or Indian mounds. They thought they had been buried there. And not only was it one person, but it was like 2 or 3 people that always talked about this, that these big mounds were in these woods. So the thought here is that a big tornado came through 297 years prior to this date. And in order to get that many trees uprooted, one, they had to have full foliage on them, perhaps. That's the theory that he thought anyway. And also the soil had to be really wet, because if it was mainly oaks coming down, it takes a lot to uproot a white oak if it's dominated by white oak timber. And as he had been with other surveys in the state, other people in the state began talking about this, and pioneers began talking about this. Like, oh yeah, I remember seeing, we just thought those were Indian mounds or Indian cemeteries, or they thought it was an ancient Native American battle where they had buried deceased Native Americans there. Well, these were likely old tornado tracks. And I'll tell you, as I've done research for since college on this, when you look at the number of creeks and townships in Indiana that are named Hurricane, it's very interesting. Because what do we know about that? Pioneers called tornadoes, they thought these were hurricanes. They call them hurricanes. And there are hurricane creeks named everywhere. And most of the time they're named because you can see a path of some hurricane that went through a woods. There was a Hurricane Creek in Spencer County, Indiana. There's one in Johnson County. There's one in the county I grew up in Davies County. And they were all found when the land was being surveyed or the first settlers arrived there. So look for Hurricane Creek. There's Hurricane Creeks in Gibson County, Indiana. And they all seem to be taking ancient tornado tracks. So to kind of summarize everything, my goal, I would like to plot some really ancient tornadoes because there's another article I found in the history of Carroll County, published in 1916, that there was this Native Americans carried this on to pioneers, that there was a massive hurricane that passed through the southern part of the county and the territory, and it knocked all the trees down and it grew up densely in timber. And it was so dense that that's where all the bobcats and that's where the cougars were and beavers were. Everybody would go hunting because you could hardly walk through it. And it was said in the early 1800s that a tornado passed there like 200 years prior to that. So we may have had an early 1600s massive tornado go through southern Carroll County, perhaps. So that would be interesting to find out some of these old tornado tracks. So to kind of end it from there, what I'm working on, and I'm really going to try to do this, is I really want to get these accounts published because I've got 200 pages right now. And these are all accounts of every severe weather and flood in Indiana that I found. And I typed it word for word from diaries, county histories, newspapers. And I've added about another 50 pages to this, but I bound this about 2015. So it's, I've got stuff in here from, I've got a tornado from 1840 in Newton County. I've got a Brown County tornado in 1820. I've got an Owen County tornado in 1818. But there's some really, if you dig hard enough, there's some really early reports. There's a report here of a violent storm and hail of very large size from a party of I think it was fur trappers in 1794. And it's got their diary here. They talk about, their travel, and I'm trying to find that hail report. Yeah, lightning and hail very large size, a heavy rain in the night, and it has Saturday, September 27th, a foggy morning. At 10 o'clock, the sun broke out very warm. But I like this stuff we're talking about today, I want it to be recorded, and it's important to record it word for word because me just talking about it doesn't do it justice. These are people that actually lived it. So the goal is, if we can add another 100 pages to it, we can bind it and get it published. Either I'll do it or we'll find a publisher to do it. Because I think there's a lot of stuff settlers talked about in weather that just buried everywhere. And you start digging, and it's funny to me, and I'm rambling on, that this is the last point I'll make. It's funny to me how I will take a report from a county history that says, oh, I had a tornado on my farm and I lost the roof of my house, and it's like 1832. And it's like June 2nd. Well, then I think, okay, well, I need to go back to newspapers in June of 1832. And all of a sudden, well, 2 counties over, oh yeah, I had hail that I've never seen before. Oh yeah, I had a tornado. And then all of a sudden you get a report from Ohio. And then you got a report from Wisconsin. And then there's a a headline from Southern Illinois, and you're like, you start piecing it together, and then you look at the observations, and it was like an 88-degree day, and you can piece it all together. There's some forensics involved in it. And the benefit of it is, one, we're preserving the pioneers' memories, but we're also able to sketch these out and say, okay, well, how does our modern day severe weather stack up to, say, the 1820s or 1840s? And are we getting more tornadoes? How's that all work? So I don't know how long I went, but I wanted to tighten it up. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Did I go an hour? Okay, that's perfect. Yeah. Again, these weather guys, you gotta tell them, like, okay, stop talking about weather, you're done. Yes.
I have a question about all of these different events over so many years.
Yeah.
And you know how we hear on the news all the time, climate change, climate change. From your perspective, from your profession, what do you feel about climate change?
It's obvious the world's getting warmer. We're holding a lot more warmth than we used to. The chemistry of our atmosphere has changed. There's a lot more CO2. We have more greenhouse gases. That's no joke. The argument is trying to take this information, apply it to today, because there were less newspapers then, there were less people. Today, every event you're going to know about. So it's hard to quantify it in a lot of ways. The world is getting warmer. There's no doubt it's getting warmer. Some of it's naturally induced, but we're adding a lot more greenhouse gas. But whether, are we causing more tornadoes? When you look at violent tornadoes, not only has the area that gets them the most changed in the past, 60, 70 years. Dixie Alley's the hotspot anymore. The Plains, it's less. In the 1880s, it was Indiana and Illinois. We had so many violent tornadoes in this area in the 1880s. The theory behind that is that, the 1880s were cooler than now, and it was probably colder aloft too. That's the theory anyway. So you had perhaps more violent outbreaks and a lot more hail around. But to kind of segue back, it's hard to quantify it. It really is, based on population and based on who was around. There may have been a pioneer that lived in the middle of the Grand Prairie in Benton County who saw a huge tornado in 1845, but it was just not documented. Maybe it was a story passed down and got lost. I always go back to that. I found a newspaper clipping of an individual who was north of Otterburn, middle of the prairie, back in 1843, and he found huge hailstones everywhere out there. It had beaten the prairie down, and he picked them up and put them in a sack, and he rode a horse to Lafayette. Like, you won't believe this, what I found. And they were still big, even when he brought them into town. I don't think I have it on here. I forget how big they were, but I think even then they were still like billiard balls or something like that. But the thing is, was that a bigger event that day? I mean, it didn't hit Lafayette. I couldn't find anything here. It's hard to say. Any other questions at all? Yes.
These not only severe weather, but recent weather, have you noticed any patterns on locations that seem to get hit more than others? Because I notice a lot of times the storm fronts coming in will start to tear apart in about the same places.
Yeah.
Rain or the snow, it just dries out right here.
There are a lot of mysteries with that. I can tell you that it sure seems the occurrence of violent tornadoes has shifted to the southeast United States in the spring, and it's kind of shifted out of the plains. And tornado alleys move around based on whether you get an El Nino or a La Nina or what other drivers are going on. To me, weather is it's a combination of a lot of things like around the world. If you think about it, it's the whole weather pattern is based on how warm is the Gulf of Mexico, And then, well, how warm's the Eastern Pacific and how cold is the Western Pacific? How warm's the Atlantic? Is the North Atlantic colder than normal? And then you got to think about, well, who has all the wet soil? Who has the dry soil? And all of these things are kind of working together to put more severe weather here, more tornadoes there, and it all kind of moves around based on all of those things every year. So I have always wondered about the way we plant corn now, because corn transpires a lot of water and it dries your dew point up. You can tell a thermometer, if it's by a cornfield, will have an insane dew point. The Galveston airport is a good example. Galveston, that airport's surrounded by corn. The dew points yesterday were incredible, and they're always really high around that airport. Well, we are planting corn very densely now. I mean, now we fit so many corn plants in it. You know, our corn populations, the amount of seed we're fitting in, we're trying to maximize our yield. Well, if you think about it, if you have wet soil and the corn's actively growing and you're pumping that much water out, you've got to think that that area is more apt to get a thunderstorm because we're pumping so much water vapor in that location. And if you think about the Corn Belt, this massive area that we're planting all this corn and pumping moisture out, you would expect that, one, it's harder to get to 100 now, and two, our summers would be wetter. And there have been some research done that when it does rain in the summer now, it really rains heavily. It's not like, I mean, you get 9 inches of rain, or you're in a drought, you get an 8-inch rain, and it's gone just like that. And there are theories that may be this density of corn planting that these populations were doing. So I've got that theory going on. And another thing we've talked about is, you know, I always hear people say, you know, the wind farms cause storms to split and whatnot, but there is a little science to that. Purdue did a study out there, had some interns that did a study on it, and those wind turbines actually mix down drier air down to the surface. They will do that. You know, if it's really humid near the ground, near those crops, those wind turbines will take the dry air from the top, mix it down, and just mix it all together. It'll do that at night when you have snow on the ground and it's really cold near the ground. What do those turbines do? You see them in California and Florida when they're going to get a freeze in like an orchard. The fans are going to mix the air. You're trying to mix the air. Well, they mix the air. They drop your dew point a little bit, and they raise your temperature a little bit at night. During the day, they may actually cool you a little bit because you're mixing some of the cooler air aloft down to the surface. And then you got to think, okay, what's that do? You know, when you're building wind farms from here all the way out through East Central Illinois. So I guess the point I'm making with that is there's just so many variables and so many theories as to why weather moves around. You've got global scales, you have local scales. And I think for us, missing the rain right now is the fact that our soils are so dry, we can't evaporate much water, and it's just a feedback. You know, if you don't have water to evaporate, you really can't form a lot of storms. We need to get a storm to wetten things down so we can get things back to evaporating water and getting storms to build back up again. Once drought sets in and it gets really dry, it feeds on itself. And the ridge only gets stronger, the heat only gets stronger. A lot of feedbacks there. Other questions at all?
Growing up, there was a lot of fence rows would have trees and stuff like that. So you're talking about the corn. Have you noticed deforestation, or not necessarily, like less trees and fence rows and hedgerows and stuff?
Yeah.
Doing the same thing?
You know, that's a really great point, because when we are doing computer modeling, you know, we do computer models to project the weather out. Well, computer models, we're trying to map out the ground, because the ground and the atmosphere are interconnected. You know, corn transpires a lot of water. If you take a forest out and put a parking lot in there, well, you're not getting the moisture is there and then it's gone. And that can have a ripple effect. So when you have a computer model, you only have so many squares in the model, right? So if I have one square and 50% of that is a field of corn and 50% is a forest, the other square is a farm and a swamp and then a crop field. And you cannot make computer models that detailed to reflect urbanization and land clearing and things like that. So in computer models, we have to assume that little square on all the models is cropland or forest. We don't know what it is, and it's changing all the time. And that ripple effect can actually lead to errors in our forecast. Because, like that future cast thing I show you, that's a computer model. Now I tweak it a little bit to make it show what I want it to show, but it is based on the assumption that, oh, well, this piece of Indiana is all crops, and this piece is all trees. It can't do the fine details of land on the model. So that's why a model will blow up a random storm and you're like, that's not going to happen. It can't comprehend everything on the ground. So when you start talking about big land use changes, like you take out fence rows, you take out trees, you turn a cornfield into a school, you see urban sprawl that's just uncontrolled going everywhere, you're going to start to see kind of the temperature change, the air movements are going to change. You look at like take an area like Indianapolis, and let's say you've got an urban heat island, the heat over Indianapolis rises. What happens to the air around Danville and Greenfield and say it towards Westfield? What happens to that air when there's so much heat in the city of Indianapolis? The air from the suburbs comes in to fill the gap. Well, when the air downtown rises, the air comes in from the suburbs, it converges downtown, and there's a little higher occurrence of thunderstorms that pop up in these urban areas during the summer. So, yeah, the land use changes models. It can change the weather. And it makes me wonder a lot about this too, because back then it was marsh, swamp, prairie, forest. And Native Americans would burn the land. They would burn prairies, and the air would be, the air be filled with smoke for weeks. The sun would be obscured. So what did that do? How did that change our weather back then, as well? So it's like I tell my wife, you start thinking about this stuff and thinking about weather, it's kind of a wormhole, it really gets deep. There's so much there to it that involves the forecasting and research. Other questions?
We have a question from online.
Yeah.
Of all the severe weather events, which one do you think has impacted the area's community memories the most, or the one people talk about the most?
Oh, well, in terms of severe weather, from a recent time, it is certainly the 74 Super Outbreak. I hear about that still to this day. All I have to do is make a post about it, and the comments just, everybody remembers that. Where I grew up, it was 1990. We had multiple violent tornadoes near my house, and people still talk about that. From winter standpoint, it's still 78. People still remember 1978, a winter not like it. Which I have a really quick story about that. When I was in grade school, I went to a small elementary school. We had like 20 kids in each class, and each grade had about 48 students. I went to a small high school. We had like 50 in our senior class, and all the classes, it was pretty steady. They all had about the same amount. The blizzard of 78 babies, we had like 3 classes, and each class was oversized. I mean, load of students. Just saying. So, but that class was huge. And everybody talked about the huge class we had. And they're like, yep, that's the blizzard of 78 babies. You know? So yeah, they talk about that one, the Palm Sunday 65 outbreak. A lot of these other big events have been lost in time because all those people have passed on. The 1920 Palm Sunday outbreak was really bad. You know, the 1942 outbreak in March was bad. That was almost equal stature to Palm Sunday. And there are a lot more outbreaks. They're all in here, but those are kind of the ones I hear about the most. The 91 ice storm too.
Yeah.
I hear about that one.
Actually, in Indiana, had a summer back in the 1800s that the snow did not.
Oh, I love that question.
I've heard about this all my life, but I'm like.
Yes, the 1816, they call it Year Without a Summer. I always wonder that because there are always legends. It snowed in June in Indiana. There's a picture of my climatology book in college. Open like chapter 7, and it showed snow like winter, and it said June 1816. I'm like, oh, come on. And it said it was in the Indiana, June 1816. That's not accurate. I actually got the weather records from Cincinnati in 1816. And it was a very cold summer, no doubt about it. It was a chilly summer. And it was in the upper 30s for lows in June. And it got into the upper 30s in August. And I believe in July, the low was like 41 at Cincinnati. So it was a cool summer. But what's interesting is it was not a year without a summer because it hit 92 in July. And it was like 91 in June. And then actually, I believe the peak temperature, because I've studied that like for years, like the peak temperature at Cincinnati in August was 88. And then the highest temperature of the whole summer and fall was in September, it was like 93. Now, I believe the 16-17 winter was really bad. The 15-16 winter was actually not that bad, but the 16-17 winter was really a rough winter. But I've compared it to the 1992 winter here because we had a patchy frost. It got down to 35 degrees in late June in 92. And I hated that summer because I didn't get a summer that year. That's how I felt. I didn't swim.
Right.
It was awful. It was cool. I was working on my 4-H project and it was like 61 and raining that night. I remember. It's like, seriously? But 1842 had some frost in the summer too. And then in 1863, we had some patchy frost in June. And we all go back to the global warming, and it is warming. I can tell you that there are several occurrences here of some patchy frost in the 1840s and the 1860s. And even in the 1880s, I think there was one year it got down to like 37 in June. And nowadays, the last time, 92, we got down to 37 in June. The last time we really had some really cool weather in summer was the 1960s and some 70s. You know, in 1964, it got down to 37 in mid-August, and which is a whole other can of worms because the 60s, you remember the 60s, it was cold. I mean, it snowed a lot. My mom talks about the 1960s and 70s. You know, you could expect some good snows back then. And that was a kind of a cool time for us. Yeah, there's a lot of cyclical nature to it. There really is. You know, we talk about it being warmer now, but I look back, you know, I think the warmest January on record here was in 1880. It was a very warm January. And I believe that was like an El Nino, if I remember correctly, that year. So it is cyclical. Yeah, 30s, very warm. What's fascinating though is 1935-36 was one of the worst winters on record. The Wabash froze and the Ohio River froze. It was horrible. And then it completely went the other way in the summer of 36 and was one of the hottest on the record. which was the odd thing. And you may wonder, I had mentioned that there were actually quite a few derechos in Indiana in the 1930s. We didn't get a lot of rain, but when we got in the summer, a lot of times it was a derecho. And you think, well, okay, why do we have that in the 30s? Well, if you think about it, where was the hot ridge? It was in the heart of the country, and those storms would follow the ridge like we've seen recently, kind of north of our area, and some of them got into our area. But it is cyclical. We're warming it up a little bit. There's some of it's naturally induced, but we're pumping a lot of CO2 out there, and I think we're just making it worse. We're not helping things. And I was reading an article that actually in the 60s and 70s, when the air was really dirty, before we really cleaned our air, those aerosols were reflecting a lot of the sunlight back. So there's a theory that the 60s and 70s cooled a little bit because the aerosols were so bad too. We've cleaned our air out a lot, and we get more sun down to the ground now too. So, other questions? Any question at all?
Thank you very much. Wait,
There's a lot of talk about the blizzard of 78.
Yeah.
How much worse than the blizzard of 77 was that?
Yeah, the 77 was really bad too. And that's the other thing.
I think that was the one that got an Amtrak train stuck up towards Fowler.
Yeah, 77 was a big one. I think 78 was worse for the wind. The 77 storm was bad too. And 77 had a colder January than 78. You cannot, even to this day, I believe that 1977 and 1885, they are right there with each other, and just how cold it was. Brutal winter. The 76, 77 winter, I don't have to tell a lot of you that. That was, and 77, 78. I think 78, 79 was
As
bad.
far as we came January 1st of 79, we did not see road top until March.
Yeah.
It was, we drove one so, and we were laughing, we're saying, oh, no wonder it's so cheap, the taxes here. You don't drive on the road at, 6 months of the year.
You feel that way. Sometimes you feel like you just hibernate.
Yeah, well, and we didn't know that there were road markings and people would honk at us, and it was like, well, and when we find, oh, that was, a straight ahead, not a turn lane.
You can't see him anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.